Why are American taxpayers funding Harvard? And what does the current Trump-Harvard battle mean for its future? Hi everyone, it's Caitlin, and welcome back to Your Financial Journey. So, our oldest sister Sophie is applying to college soon, and before you know it, it will be my turn and Ava's turn, meaning that quite a few of our family dinner conversations revolve around colleges. And one of the names that have popped up often in recent weeks is Harvard University. Harvard is currently battling the federal government about how effectively it is fighting anti-Semitism on campus, and whether it should put an end to some practices that the Trump administration considers discriminatory. I suspect many of us will have heard or read about this already. In the heat of the confrontation, the administration has announced that it would freeze all federal funding to the university. Harvard immediately reacted by suing the government in an attempt to call off the freeze and resume the sending of funds. And just yesterday, President Trump said again that the government would revoke Harvard's tax-exempt status. Now, at the time of this taping, we don't know yet how this will all end. What we do know, though, is that there is a lot at stake and there are some big numbers being thrown around. This AP article quotes $2.2 billion in frozen grants from the federal government, which is on the low end, while Reuters claims a much bigger amount at stake of $9 billion in federal funds. So, because our parents have taught us to always look at the facts first, let's get to the bottom of what the fight over federal funding to universities is all about. Here are the 3 questions that we'll be answering in today's video. First, why is Harvard getting federal money at all and how much are they receiving? Second, can't Harvard just dip into its savings or its endowment? And third, what are the indirect ways Harvard benefits from federal support? Let's get started, my financial friend. Why is Harvard getting federal money at all and how much are they receiving? Harvard was founded in 1636, long before the U.S. itself, and is today the oldest and probably most prestigious university in the country. Harvard is also a private institution that charges hefty fees to its students, so it's no wonder that many people are asking the question, why is Harvard getting any federal money at all? So, as a private institution, Harvard is, in theory, responsible for its own budget and needs to find the money for the salaries of its employees as well as for rent and all other expenses on its own. The federal government does not generally subsidize these costs. However, the upside is that Harvard, because it has to raise the money on its own, can also decide on its own how it wants to spend its money. But, as my parents like to say, theory sounds much better on paper. Because in real life, as we're just seeing, it seems Harvard is still getting a fair bit of money from the government. And because it gets money from the government, naturally, would very much like to have a say, in return, on how Harvard spends the government's money and conducts itself. And the solution to this riddle is that Harvard sometimes does specific work for the federal government. Think of it like a research project. For example, the federal government may decide that it wants to better understand how a certain type of cancer develops because doing this might help with finding a cure for that cancer. So, it asks the Harvard Biology Department to help with some research on that. And, because there is no such thing as a free lunch in real life, Harvard will send the federal government a bill for the work its researchers are doing on this cancer project. And that's what Harvard gets most of its federal money to do. Research projects at the request of the government, and these are funds that the Trump administration has partially frozen. Of course, losing these amounts would be painful for the university. If the government stopped paying for these projects, Harvard would either have to find the money to pay these researchers from its own funds, or it might have to fire them. Both are not really pleasant options, and that explains why the federal government may still have a fair degree of influence over private universities like Harvard. However, some of the numbers that we have seen screaming from various headlines seem a bit high. $9 billion in taxpayer dollars to Harvard for research sounds like a lot of research, at least to me. So we did some digging. The good news here is that Harvard is not just an institute for research and higher learning. It's also a corporation. A not-for-profit corporation, to be precise, but still, a corporation that has to manage its finances properly. And so, Harvard regularly shares updates about its finances with the wider public. Here's what they published shortly after the federal government announced the freeze on its grant. The university historically has received substantial support for research from the federal government, totaling 11% of annual operating revenues in the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2024. In the last fiscal year, the university received $686 million in federal funding research, and the total multi-year federal commitment, which includes promises already made for the next few years, sums up to $1.6 billion. So these are large numbers, and $686 million in a year is an awful lot of money, at least for me. But given that Harvard is probably the wealthiest university in the world, and this amounts to just 11% of their annual budget, why can't it dig into its deep pockets to make up the shortfall? Which brings us to the next question for today's video. Can't Harvard just dip into its savings, or its endowment? Harvard has savings and investments of about $53 billion, mainly donations from alumni and friends, what's referred to as their endowment. Now, $53 billion is really a lot of money, even for Harvard, and should be able to last quite a while even if they had to withdraw a bit more, right? Unfortunately, there are 3 reasons why it would be difficult to just turn to the endowment to fully compensate for any frozen federal funds. First, the money in the endowment is often restricted. When people give money to Harvard, they often attach conditions. For example, a former student may fondly recall their time in the gym and give some money for the future upkeep and expansion of the swimming pool. This condition is then binding for the university, and Harvard could not divert these funds to pay for the salary of a cancer researcher whose federal grant has been frozen. And because 70% of the funds in the endowment are restricted in some way, the administration has actually much less flexibility with the endowment than it might wish. Second, the endowment has a mandate that it should last forever, that it should always be around to support future generations of students and scholars. In practical terms, this means that the university needs to make sure that the substance of the endowment, meaning the value of the endowment after inflation, stays stable. But with this mandate, Harvard can only withdraw any extra profits from the endowment every year, any return that the endowment generates that is higher than inflation. Which leads us to the third point. Harvard is already pretty much spending as much as it can from the endowment. Last year, the endowment contributed $2.4 billion to the budget of the university, an impressive 37% of the total spending. But as the last annual report explains, the target return for Harvard's endowment is 8% in the long run. Of these 8%, Harvard assumes that 3% are needed to maintain the purchasing power of the investments in the face of inflation, which leaves 5% for spending every year. And the $2.4 billion that the endowment contributed to Harvard's operating budget were already pretty much the 5% of the endowment. So any additional withdrawals from the endowment might violate the mandate to keep the endowment around forever. So Harvard may have less of a cushion and be more vulnerable to financial pressure from the federal government than it would like. But federally funded research grants are not the only monetary pressure points, so to speak, because the government also provides indirect support to Harvard and other universities that may come under threat. So let's talk about that now. What are the indirect ways Harvard benefits from federal support? Like most other not-for-profit universities, Harvard enjoys a tax-exempt status that has been granted to it by the IRS under federal law. Now, as anyone who has ever paid taxes will probably agree, that's a big deal. Who wouldn't wish to be tax-exempt? So for Harvard, being tax-exempt has 3 main advantages. First, the university does not pay taxes on much of its income, including on investment income from its endowment. Second, the university does not have to pay property taxes, although we understand that Harvard voluntarily pays some contributions to the city of Boston. And third, the tax-exempt status allows Harvard to receive tax-deductible donations, and it's generally much easier to ask friends and former students for a contribution when they can deduct any gift to Harvard from their own tax bill. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, just yesterday, President Trump said again that the government would revoke Harvard's tax-exempt status. Shortly afterwards, a Harvard spokesperson told ABC News that there's no legal basis to rescind the university's tax-exempt status, and said it would endanger the school's ability to carry out its mission. So it seems that this will drag on for a while, especially since the first court date for the initially frozen funds is only scheduled for after mid-July. I think it's fair to say, though, that if Harvard's tax-exempt status were to be revoked, this could be really, really bad, because it might mean that the entire way of how Harvard is funding itself, and especially how the university raises the donations it needs for its operations, might come under threat. To summarize, while Harvard is a private institution with a substantial endowment, meaning they won't go broke overnight, it may feel the pressure very fast if the federal government were to freeze or cancel the grants it's providing to the university. In addition, if the IRS as part of the federal government were to take away the tax-exempt status of the university, this might require Harvard to completely rethink its business model, especially because gifts to the university would not be tax deductible for the donor anymore, and much of its income would not be tax-free. But the biggest danger in all of this is that Harvard's stellar reputation may start to suffer over time. And this may also mean that the best people that Harvard used to attract, whether that may be the students, researchers, professors, and even donors, could, over time, increasingly take their skills, talents, and/or money to other private or public universities, where there is less uncertainty and bad publicity around government funding and tax exemptions. So what do you think? Should the government have a say on how Harvard spends the government's money and conducts itself? And, if yes, should the administration pull the university's funding if it's not allowed to have a say? Drop a comment below and let us know. And if you're interested in learning more about one of the most powerful financial players in the current administration, check out this video here on U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. And make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed today's video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.